In 2025, a shocking truth explodes from the shadows of more than half a century of silence. A death that the entire community once called an accident is finally exposed as a crime meticulously concealed for decades. Not long ago, what seemed buried deep in dusty files suddenly resurfaces like a hammer blow to the collective memory. The woman who died quietly in the bathroom in 1962 did not pass away due to everyday risks, but because a human hand drowned the truth along with her. Today, I will plunge you straight into the eye of the storm of a tragedy spanning more than 6 decades, what really happened on that fateful morning in Alabama. Why an accident was able to deceive the law, science, and the entire community, and how the truth finally emerges from where it was buried. This is not just a cold case being reopened. It is a chilling testament to how perfectly evil can hide itself in the ordinary facade of family life. This is the story of a tiny detail powerful enough to silence justice for generations, and of forensic science patiently knocking on the door of the past until it is forced to answer. You are my most valuable companions on this journey. Take a deep breath, because right now, we are stepping into a story that will make you question every accident you ever believed was harmless. Before diving deep into this shocking real-life case, let me know where you're watching from, and if you love these journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The summer of 1962 draped central Alabama in a heavy, sluggish atmosphere, where the heat seemed to make every movement more cautious, and the small streets of Birmingham still woke up to their familiar rhythm, quietly and steadily, as if nothing could disrupt that order. That morning began just like any other in the Hale family home, where Margaret Hale woke up early, prepared breakfast in the kitchen, opened the windows to let the hot wind rush in, and listened to the sparse traffic outside. No one could say there was anything unusual in how she started her day. No warning signs, no hurried or distracted actions. A neighbor later recalled seeing Margaret standing on the porch, fixing her hair and waving politely, a scene so ordinary that no one would remember it if not for what happened afterward. That was the last time anyone confirmed seeing Margaret Hale alive. Leonard Hale left the house shortly after, dressed neatly as usual, saying he had errands to run outside, and would return later, his voice calm, without any rush or tension, and leaving no impression that something beyond routine was about to happen in that home. When the door closed behind Leonard, the morning continued in the familiar quiet of the neighborhood, until time began to create an inexplicable void. By nearing noon, Margaret did not appear where she was supposed to be, something rare since she was always careful and punctual. At first, family members thought she might be delayed for some minor reason, but as the hours passed without news, anxiety began to spread quietly. Phone calls were made, first to her workplace, then to acquaintances and friends, but all received the same answer: no one had seen Margaret, no one had spoken to her that day. The house remained there, silent amid the summer heat, as if guarding a secret no one was ready to face. The family began searching on their own, walking around the neighborhood, asking each neighbor, repeating Margaret's name in vain, but every path seemed to lead to empty space. The longer time dragged on, the greater the unease grew, because Margaret was not the type to leave without a word, nor did she take essentials for a trip. As the afternoon fell, the heat had not eased, and unanswered questions grew heavier than the surrounding air. The family faced an undeniable reality: Margaret had vanished from their everyday lives, without leaving any clear trace. Finally, when all self-search efforts yielded no results, they had no choice but to do the only thing left: pick up the phone and report to local police that Margaret Hale was missing. A decision marking the moment that peaceful morning officially ended, giving way to a chain of events no one in the family could foresee. The Hale family's missing person call was received at the local police station in the late afternoon, during a time usually quiet for serious cases, and from the first words, the duty officer recognized this was not a panicked, baseless call, but a considered report after hours of fruitless searching. Initial information was carefully recorded. The victim's name was Margaret Hale, an adult woman with a family and stable job. No history of running away or unusual loss of contact. The last confirmed sighting was that morning at her own home, and the time since loss of contact was long enough to exceed normal absence. A missing person file was opened that same day, something not always done in 1962 Alabama, where many similar cases were often delayed, assuming adults could leave voluntarily. Officers were dispatched to the Hale home almost immediately, and there they conducted quick, concise but targeted interviews, starting with family members present, asking them to recount the day's details in chronological order, from when Margaret woke up to the moment the family decided to call police. These accounts were cross-checked for any inconsistencies, but all revolved around one reality. Margaret had not appeared anywhere she usually went, and no one had received a message or call from her since morning. Leonard Hale was interviewed separately, in a quiet space to avoid influence from others, and he recounted his morning coherently, from leaving the house to what he did that day. His voice calm, attitude cooperative, not avoiding questions. He confirmed that when he left, Margaret was still home, and said nothing about going anywhere, and that he was as surprised as the family when she did not show up at work. Investigators noted this statement without reason to doubt it yet, because at that point, no detail was clear enough to place Leonard in any position other than the husband who last saw his wife. From the gathered statements, an initial timeline was quickly built on paper. Morning, Margaret still at home, Leonard leaves, the period between morning and noon, with no confirmation of Margaret appearing outside, and by noon, her absence noticed. What stood out to police was not what was in that timeline, but what was missing. No signs of preparing to leave, no unusual actions in prior days, no reported conflicts, and no words from Margaret indicating she planned to disappear. Officers quickly assessed that voluntary departure was very unlikely, because Margaret took no personal essentials for a trip, withdrew no money, made no arrangements for work or family, and most importantly, left no note. In that context, the case was classified as suspicious disappearance, a term implying this vanishing might involve danger, not just temporary absence. The decision to investigate was made in the first work session, with clear priority: confirm if Margaret appeared at work or on her usual route, and then return to the home for a more thorough check, because if Margaret did not leave those familiar spaces, the answer likely lay where she was last seen. Officers agreed that all next steps must rely on objective facts, avoiding early speculation, and meanwhile, Margaret Hale's missing person file was placed on the desk as a case needing close monitoring, because the more time passed without traces, the more urgent and unavoidable the question of her whereabouts became. Right after Margaret Hale's missing person file was opened, investigators moved to the next step almost instinctively, because in every unexplained disappearance, the first question is always whether the person truly left their daily routine, or was stopped somewhere along the familiar path. The first destination was Margaret's workplace, an address tied to her fixed schedule rarely disrupted. There the answers left little room for speculation. Margaret had not shown up for work that morning, without prior notice, no phone call to request leave, no one to relay a message, and no note that could explain the sudden absence. Colleagues described Margaret as punctual, careful, and responsible, a person who, if faced with an emergency, would try to notify in advance, even with a short call. This made her absence stand out more than usual, not because it was rare for everyone, but because it was rare for Margaret herself. Police requested a full review of the morning at the workplace, from opening time to mid-noon, asking if anyone received a call from Margaret, saw her stop by and leave early, or noted any unusual event related to her name. But all led to the same conclusion: Margaret had not appeared there that day, and her absence left no tangible trace. From the workplace, the investigation extended to the daily route Margaret usually took, a path so familiar that many could describe it without thinking. Investigators walked along that route, stopping at the most likely points for witnesses, from small roadside shops to gas stations and homes overlooking the street, asking the same repeated question: did anyone see Margaret Hale pass by that morning? The answers, though given in good faith, were all negative. No one remembered seeing Margaret, no one recalled a woman resembling her, and no one noted any incident that might relate to a pedestrian, an unusually stopped vehicle, or a situation drawing attention. This silence was not evidence of anything, but in an investigation context, it carried its own meaning, because a person disappearing from a familiar route without trace is often not the result of a simple plan change. Police also checked if Margaret used any other transportation contrary to habit, but no information showed she borrowed a car, hitched a ride, or arranged an unplanned trip. Those questioned agreed on one point: if Margaret intended to leave the area, she would not do so without telling at least one person, and certainly not without preparing. When officers returned to compile what they had gathered in the afternoon and early evening, the picture was not a chain of clear clues, but an ever-widening void. Margaret was not at work, did not appear on her usual route, and left no sign she changed her schedule. Factors often used to explain voluntary disappearances, like personal stress, prior preparation, or signs of abandoning current life, were absent here. This forced investigators to raise the question they usually delay until other possibilities are ruled out, because it always carries worrisome implications. If Margaret went nowhere, if she did not reach work, did not appear on the familiar route, and showed no sign of leaving her life, then where had she been all that time? This question was not speculative, but a direct result of each possibility being eliminated one by one, and it shifted the investigation direction from assuming harmless absence to considering more serious scenarios. Though no one was ready to say it aloud yet, officers understood that every passing minute without answers would make the search harder, but they also recognized that rushing conclusions could lead to irreparable mistakes. Meanwhile, those directly connected to Margaret began realizing her disappearance was not a random delay or simple misunderstanding, but an event shattering the familiar order of daily life. An absence unexplained by ordinary reasons. For police, this meant the investigation could not stop at surface checks, because what they did not find on Margaret's route and at her workplace was as important, if not more than any trace they might have found, and the question of where Margaret was began to become the pivot of the entire search effort in the hours ahead. The unfillable gaps in the search of the workplace and the familiar route had forced attention back to the Hale family home, where everything remained exactly as it had been on the morning Margaret disappeared, and that very stillness could no longer be ignored by the investigators. The front door opened onto the familiar smell of everyday living space, with no signs of hurried disturbance, no items shifted as if someone had left in a state of distress, and Leonard Hale stood beside them, cooperative, allowing the police to examine each room with a calm that was hard to distinguish between confidence and habit. The living room appeared tidy, the sofa in its proper place, small decorative items undisturbed and upright, the floor clean with no muddy footprints or drag marks, all creating a picture far too ordinary for a place just assumed to be the starting point of a suspicious disappearance. The kitchen bore traces of the morning that had passed, a few items still out on the counter, cabinets closed, the trash can showing no signs of being rummaged through, and Margaret's personal belongings remained in their usual spots, as if she had only stepped away for a moment and would return at any time. The officers noted the presence of her purse, papers, and the essential items a woman would normally take if planning to go far away, all still there, nothing missing, nothing deliberately gathered together, and this continued to undermine the possibility that Margaret had left voluntarily. The bedroom was opened next, where the private atmosphere of family life was evident in the familiar order, Margaret's clothes hanging neatly in the closet, drawers closed, no unusual empty spaces suggesting she had selected and taken what she needed, the bed showing no signs of a hurried departure or a sleepless night, and the small but habitual personal items still in their proper places. These details, though not directly pointing to what had happened, told a different story. Margaret had shown no behavior indicating preparation to leave her life that day, and if she had vanished, that vanishing carried none of the usual signs of an intentional decision. The police continued to sweep the other spaces in the house with the same cautious approach, looking for the slightest indications of intrusion or struggle, but the windows were intact, the locks showed no pry marks, and there were no signs that a stranger had entered by force. Leonard was asked about anyone who might have keys or access, and he provided a short list, names that did not immediately stand out, yet every piece of information was noted, because in cases like this, seemingly harmless details sometimes become crucial links when placed correctly. What unsettled the investigators was not the presence of a specific suspicious sign, but the near-total absence of them, a state that made every hypothesis fragile and forced them to read the house differently, not by what had happened, but by what had not. No rummaging, no preparation, no disturbance, and no signs of a violent break-in, all coexisting in a space whose owner had vanished without explanation. Leonard's constant presence during the search was noted neutrally, for his cooperative attitude fit the image of a worried husband, yet it also provided no additional information to explain Margaret's absence, and that caused the officers to focus more on the house itself than on words. Each room was re-examined with greater scrutiny, every corner attended to, every door opened to ensure no space was overlooked, because experience showed that in disappearances leaving no external traces, the answer often lay in the least expected places. This shift in approach was not announced aloud, but it showed clearly in how the officers began to view the entire private area of the house as a whole that needed full understanding, rather than merely the backdrop for an event that might have occurred elsewhere. Spaces once considered safe and familiar were now seen differently, not with the assumption they were innocent, but with the awareness that Margaret's disappearance might be tied to these very walls. Leonard seemed to sense the change through the prolonged pace of the search and the more detailed questions, but his response remained calm, no objections, no panic, and this was recorded as a fact rather than a suspicious sign. During the sweep, the investigators paid special attention to the absence of any indication that Margaret had left the house after the morning, because if she had not gone out in the usual way, the possibility that she had left unusually, or not left at all, began to emerge more clearly. It was this realization that led to the decision to systematically check all private areas of the house, from rarely used spaces to those often overlooked in initial searches, a decision not based on a specific clue, but on the logic of elimination. Expanding the scope of the search did not yield an immediate answer, but it marked a subtle turning point in the investigation's direction, shifting from looking for traces of a departure to confronting the possibility that Margaret's disappearance might not be the result of an interrupted journey, but an event that had occurred within this very space. The house, with its quiet and familiar exterior, now became the center of unanswered questions, and the atmosphere within it, though without chaos, carried a different weight, as if the silence was concealing more than it revealed. The officers understood that deciding to focus on the entire private area of the house would lead them to more difficult possibilities, but also ones they could not avoid if they wanted a convincing explanation for why Margaret Hale had disappeared without leaving external traces. And this change, though not yet producing concrete evidence, laid the groundwork for a new investigative direction, where the question was no longer where Margaret had gone, but what had happened to her before she could leave this house. Attention had been fully focused on the most private spaces of the house, and it was during that examination that the bathroom door became an unavoidable stopping point. A space that was familiar, yet felt detached from the rest of the home, where the light filtered in more dimly, and the air seemed thicker. When the door was fully opened, the scene inside immediately changed the nature of the search, for Margaret Hale was no longer an invisible missing person, but was present there, motionless in the bathtub, her body lying on its side with the upper part face down in the water, her dark hair spread out and soaked, as if time had stopped at the exact moment she ceased moving. The officers paused for a few seconds, not out of hesitation but to accurately register what they were seeing, because from that moment on, every small detail carried decisive meaning. The water in the tub had not overflowed, the level just enough to cover the upper part of the body, and the room showed no signs of chaos or struggle, the towel still hanging nearby, the floor not unusually slippery, and no items knocked over or forcefully displaced. Margaret's position evoked a familiar image in household accident cases, where a person slips and cannot escape, and that very familiarity led some present initially to feel this might be a regrettable tragedy, rather than an intentional act. However, the investigators' eyes were quickly drawn to one detail out of place. A metal wall fixture, meant for hanging towels, had been pulled from its mounting and lay in the tub near the body, its surface still wet, the wall attachment showing clear damage. This item was noted immediately, not because it instantly suggested criminal activity, but because it seemed to provide a straightforward explanation for what had happened, a perfect piece for the accident narrative. Margaret slips, reaches for the towel rack, it gives way, and she falls into the tub in a position from which she cannot save herself. The scene, on the surface, seemed to support that hypothesis suspiciously well, for everything was in an order not overly chaotic, with no clear signs of outside intervention, and the room bore no traces of a struggle. Leonard Hale was asked to remain outside the bathroom while the officers carried out initial documentation, and his reaction, though showing shock, stayed within the range police often see in those suddenly facing unexpected tragedy. Photographs of the scene were taken from multiple angles to preserve exactly the body's position, the water level in the tub, the location of the dislodged metal fixture, and the general state of the room, as these details would later form the basis for all further analysis. Margaret's body was confirmed deceased, and at that moment, the case file officially changed status, from an unexplained disappearance to a death requiring clarification, though no conclusion about the cause had yet been reached. The atmosphere in the house changed markedly, for the previous silence now carried a different meaning. No longer vague waiting, but the presence of death, forcing everyone present to adjust their approach. The wall-mounted metal fixture was carefully collected as part of the scene, placed in an evidence bag with full notes on its original position and condition, because even if it appeared merely supportive of the accident theory, investigative experience demanded that no item directly related to the scene be overlooked. The officers also closely examined the tub surface and surrounding area for signs of slipping or impact, but what they found continued to reinforce the sense that the room had not experienced a clearly violent event, at least by easily recognizable standards. The water in the tub showed no signs of violent disturbance, other bathroom items remained in their usual places, and there were no bloodstains or visible external injuries on Margaret's body from a distance. It was precisely the absence of those signs that led the initial scene assessment to align with a household accident, a preliminary conclusion explaining why Margaret had not appeared at work, and why no one had seen her leave the house. However, determining whether it was truly an accident could not be concluded at the scene, as the officer's task then was not to conclude, but to preserve every detail for later review. Margaret's body was prepared for removal according to proper procedure, and before that occurred, every final detail in the bathroom was rechecked, not to search for something specific, but to ensure no element was missed in the overall picture. Discovering Margaret in the bathtub provided an answer to where she was, but it simultaneously opened a chain of other questions, less clear and harder to face, because death, even when it looks like an accident, remains an outcome demanding careful explanation. The case file was updated that same evening, with the new status reflecting the reality that this was no longer a disappearance but a death to be investigated through proper legal channels. Meanwhile, the Hale house, once the center of an anxious search, now became the scene of a death, and this transition occurred without the dramatic signs often seen, but in a heavy silence where everything appeared too normal for the gravity of what had just been discovered. The removal of Margaret Hale's body from the house closed the search phase and opened another, more decisive one, where all speculation had to yield to conclusions based on forensic medicine, and from that point, the central question was no longer where Margaret had been, but what had truly happened to her in her final hours. The county morgue, with its cold white lights and the distinctive smell of disinfecting chemicals, became the place where Margaret's death was stripped of personal emotions and placed under a scientific lens, though the limitations of science in 1962 were still clearly present. The forensic pathologist began by recording the overall condition of the body, measuring basic indicators, and observing the surface for any abnormalities that might indicate intervention by another person. But what they found was not dramatic. No open wounds, no signs of a clear assault, and the skin showed no easily recognizable injuries, beyond the physiological changes typical after death. The examination continued with the respiratory system, and here the signs consistent with drowning gradually became clearer, as water was found in the airways along with other characteristic features, sufficient to lead the doctors to conclude that Margaret had died from inability to breathe. This conclusion, though technical, did not by itself explain the circumstances leading to death, but it laid an important foundation for the entire file, as it ruled out certain other possibilities, like stroke or sudden internal medical conditions. Tests were conducted to detect the presence of alcohol or substances affecting cognition, because in many cases, loss of control due to intoxication or medication can contribute to bathroom accidents, but the results came back negative, showing Margaret was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of death. This detail was carefully noted, as it both eliminated some scenarios and made others harder to assess, since a physiologically alert person is generally expected to respond better to dangerous situations. The examination of the head and neck area was conducted with high focus, as this is where traces of strong impacts often remain if the victim was attacked before death, but the doctors found no skull fractures or clear brain hemorrhage, signs that in the forensic context of the time were considered key evidence of violence. The absence of these injuries made it difficult to prove that Margaret had been knocked unconscious before drowning, at least with the diagnostic tools available. The autopsy report continued to document the condition of other organs, but no findings stood out enough to alter the overall picture, forming one in which Margaret's death fit the description of a household accident more than an intentional act. For the investigators, this report was both an answer and a limitation, as it provided a clear cause of death, but offered no evidence strong enough to cross the legal threshold for homicide. In internal discussions, those working the file had to confront the reality that despite unanswered questions, the medical facts did not support pursuing a criminal hypothesis at that time. Forensics noted no defensive wounds, no injuries indicating Margaret had resisted, and no direct biological evidence suggesting another person's presence in the final moment. These absences were not taken as proof of innocence, but as a reflection of objective limitations in collecting and analyzing data, in an era when many modern techniques did not yet exist. The autopsy report was completed with cautious language, avoiding assertions beyond the collected data, and the final conclusion reflected that cause of death was drowning, no alcohol or drugs detected, no clear craniocerebral trauma, and insufficient scientific basis to determine that this death resulted from homicide. For those hoping for a definitive answer, this report could be disappointing, but within the legal and scientific framework of the time, it represented the highest degree of certainty achievable. The investigators understood that continuing to pursue a criminal investigation without supporting forensic evidence would be not only difficult but risky for serious error, and thus they had to weigh every next step within the established limits. Forensics, through the silence of what was not found, acted as a brake on speculation exceeding the facts, and that left the investigation in a suspended state, where the answer seemed within reach, yet not sharp enough to be called complete truth. In that context, Margaret Hale's death was shaped on paper as a tragedy possible in daily life, a conclusion not because it was absolutely convincing, but because no other option was solid enough to replace it, and this shortfall marked the first milestone in a long road ahead for the case, where unanswered questions were temporarily set aside, awaiting the day when science or circumstances would allow them to be raised once more. The first autopsy report, with its cautious but clear conclusion that the cause of death was drowning, and the absence of any decisive signs of violence, created a powerful pull that pushed the entire case toward the accident hypothesis. And from that point on, the direction of the investigation began to narrow along a trajectory that was almost impossible to reverse. For the investigators, the question was no longer whether Margaret Hale had been murdered, but whether there was any factor strong enough to break the logical framework of a domestic accident backed by forensic evidence, and the answer, at least at that time, appeared to be no. The bathroom scene, with the position of the body, the water level in the tub, and the presence of the wall-mounted metal fixture that had been pulled out, continued to be viewed as a reasonable sequence of circumstances, leading to a tragic but not uncommon outcome. The fact that no alcohol, drugs, or poison was detected in Margaret's body did not weaken the accident scenario, as it did not require any additional unusual factor to explain the events, and in the context of a criminal investigation, simpler explanations often have the advantage when there is no strong counter-evidence. The officers reviewed every detail they had collected, from the statements of those involved to the scene records, and realized that every piece could be arranged to fit the hypothesis that Margaret had slipped in the bathroom and been unable to save herself. Leonard Hale, as the last person to see his wife alive, was naturally given special attention, but his statement, delivered consistently from beginning to end, contained no internal contradictions that could be exploited, nor did it conflict with the physical or forensic medical findings. He described his morning in the same sequence, using the same details, with no changes even when questioned repeatedly at different times, a fact that investigators of that era often saw as a sign of honesty rather than fabrication. There were no direct witnesses to contradict Leonard's account, no physical evidence placing him in a situation different from what he described, and in that context, challenging his statement became difficult, both legally and procedurally. Internal discussions gradually shifted from searching for new leads to assessing whether continuing the investigation in a criminal direction was still reasonable, as each next step required resources and time, while the likelihood of obtaining new results grew increasingly dim. Forensics had done its part, the scene did not contradict that conclusion, and Leonard's statement provided no foothold for an accusation. All of it together formed a picture stable enough to be accepted as the official explanation. The wall-mounted metal fixture, though considered a key detail of the scene, was not treated as evidence of a crime, but as a factor reinforcing the accident scenario, and thus it was collected, labeled, and stored according to procedure, not to serve an ongoing investigation, but as part of a complete file that had reached its conclusion. Other evidence, from scene photographs to recorded reports, was reorganized, numbered, and placed in storage, where it would remain unless there was a clear legal reason to review it again. The decision to close the file was not made in a single moment, but was the result of a prolonged deliberation process in which every remaining possibility was placed on the table and successively eliminated for lack of basis. For the investigators, this was not a surrender but adherence to the principle that the criminal justice system cannot operate on vague suspicions or unease, but must be based on provable evidence. The case file was ultimately reclassified from an open investigation to a death explained as an accident, and with that, the priority given to it decreased significantly. Any lingering questions, if they existed, did not disappear, but they were pushed out of the center of attention, making way for other cases that were more urgent and clear-cut. Leonard Hale continued his life without facing any criminal charges, as the system had no official reason to keep him in the role of suspect, and all his interactions with the police gradually became memories of a phase that had passed. For Margaret's family, the closing of the file brought a form of closure that was hard to accept, where they had a cause of death but no complete resolution to their emotional questions, yet legally, the case had been handled. On paper, Margaret Hale's death was no longer a mystery to be clarified, but a regrettable accident, a conclusion sufficient to close the official procedures, even if it did not ease every concern. From the moment the file was placed in storage, the case entered what the system calls closed, a status that does not mean all truth has been revealed, but only that, with what was available, there was no further investigative path that could proceed without exceeding the limits of evidence. The related documents were neatly filed, the evidence items placed on storage shelves, and Margaret Hale's name gradually left the list of cases being actively monitored, becoming a line in a file, a story that had been labeled and put away. It was at that moment, though not announced dramatically, that the case officially became a cold case, not because it was deemed unimportant, but because the system had reached its limit in pursuing answers, and anything remaining, if it existed, would have to wait for another time, another tool, or another perspective to be brought to light. The silence enveloping Margaret Hale's file lasted for many years, long enough for her name to become a familiar, but no longer mentioned entry on the list of cases needing priority, until a review of old files was launched as part of a system-wide effort to reassess deaths that had been concluded in the context of the limitations of past forensic science. Such reviews were not aimed at finding specific errors, but at determining whether any cases, in the light of new knowledge and tools, could be viewed differently from the original conclusion. Among the dozens of files pulled from storage, Margaret Hale's case did not stand out in the usual sense, as it bore no clear signs of a mistake, nor was it tied to public pressure or external demands for reinvestigation. However, it was precisely that ordinariness that caught the attention of a new investigator, who approached the file for the first time without memories or biases from the original investigation, having only the dry documents neatly arranged in legal order. The rereading of the file began slowly, through each report, each forensic record, each scene photograph, not to prove the old conclusion wrong, but to understand how that conclusion had been formed. This investigator recognized that every step in the past had been reasonable in its context, from accepting the accident hypothesis to closing the file when there was no counter-evidence, and it was that very reasonableness that made the case harder to approach, as there was no obvious error to start with. However, when the documents were examined from a different angle, not to look for clear signs of violence, but to assess the completeness of the assumptions used, a question began to form, not from what was asserted, but from what had been taken for granted. The bathroom scene in the old file was described as consistent with an accident, but that description rested on the assumption that the wall-mounted metal fixture had been pulled out as a result of grasping during a slip, an assumption never tested through experiment or specific technical analysis. The new investigator lingered longer on the description of this evidence item, not because it was new, but because of how quickly it had been accepted as a natural explanation for the entire chain of events. The scene photos showed the fixture's position, the extent of the damage, and the visual connection to the body's posture, all creating a reasonable story, but the investigator wondered whether that reasonableness was the result of verification, or simply the comfort of finding an explanation that fit intuition. The review continued with the forensic reports, where the drowning conclusion was based on clear physiological signs, but the investigator also noted that the report did not affirm an accident, but only ruled out certain other causes, leaving space for multiple possibilities to coexist. That space, in the original investigation's context, had been filled by the simplest hypothesis, but in the current context, it began to be seen as an area needing re-examination. The investigator found no contradictions in Leonard Hale's statement, but also realized that consistency did not mean it reflected the full truth, especially when the underlying assumptions had never been challenged. Another question gradually emerged, not accusatory but methodological. If the wall-mounted metal fixture could not have been pulled out in the assumed way, then what foundation would the entire chain of reasoning leading to the accident conclusion stand on? This question was not intended to assert that a crime had occurred, but to check whether an untested assumption had played a pivotal role in shaping the conclusion. During the review, the new investigator realized that Margaret Hale's case lacked not data, but systematic skepticism toward that data, a understandable absence given the science and practices of decades earlier. Pulling the file from storage did not create an immediate legal change, but it marked a shift in thinking, from accepting the old conclusion to re-asking questions that previously no one had reason or ability to pose. Margaret Hale's file, once seen as complete, was now read as an open text, where gaps and assumptions became clearer when viewed with eyes unbound by the pressure to close the case. It was in this process that questions about the bathroom scene, the role of the wall-mounted metal fixture, and how those elements had been interpreted, gradually emerged as a point needing deeper examination. Not to deny the past, but to check whether the past had been fully understood. The question about the bathroom scene, once formed during the file review, was no longer a fleeting thought that could be easily set aside, but became an anchor drawing the entire re-examination's attention. Pulling investigators back to the detail once seen as the most reasonable explanation for Margaret Hale's death, the wall-mounted metal towel rack, pulled out from its fixed position in the bathtub. In the 1962 file, this detail appeared almost self-explanatory, as the image of a woman slipping in the bathroom, reaching out to grab the towel rack and accidentally pulling it out, was a familiar scenario, easy to visualize and intuitive for anyone who had ever stepped into a slippery bathroom. That very familiarity had prevented the metal fixture from being treated as a question needing an answer, but rather as a ready-made answer, sufficient to connect the scene, the body's posture, and the drowning conclusion into a complete story. However, when the new investigator reread the file with the aim of understanding how the accident conclusion had been built, what stood out was not the presence of the evidence, but the complete absence of any effort to verify the hypothesis attached to it. There was no force testing report, no analysis of the metal structure or mounting method, and no document indicating that a serious question had ever been raised about whether a person could pull the fixture out in the described situation. The accident hypothesis, instead of being strengthened by experimental data, had been accepted based on surface reasonableness and the lack of counter-evidence, an approach not unusual in criminal investigations of the early 1960s, when many conclusions still relied heavily on experience and professional intuition. The investigator realized that the entire reasoning around the bathroom scene was actually built on a chain of successive assumptions, with the wall-mounted metal fixture serving as the central link, yet never examined as an independent physical element. The file described that the fixture had been pulled out from the wall, but there was no specific information about the type of screws used, the mounting depth, or the wall material behind it, all factors determining its load-bearing capacity. In 1962, such details might have been seen as purely technical and unnecessary for a case deemed an accident, but in retrospect, they were precisely the questions never asked. The scene photos were examined more closely, not to search for signs of violence, but to assess the relationship between the extent of the fixture's damage and the assumed scenario. Some images showed the wall mount portion deformed in a way not entirely consistent with a downward pull, but those details, standing alone, were not enough to refute the accident hypothesis, and for that reason, they had not been noted in the original investigation. The investigator realized that the accident hypothesis was not wrong because it was illogical, but because it had never been tested, and in both science and criminal investigation, reasonableness cannot replace evidence. The wall-mounted metal fixture had been used as an explanation without needing to prove itself, and that is what made it a blind spot in the file. When setting the accident hypothesis aside and viewing the evidence as an independent object, the core question emerged more clearly: whether this metal fixture could have been pulled out by the force a person in a typical slipping situation could generate. This question carried no accusatory intent, but was methodological, because if the answer was no, then the entire chain of reasoning leading to the accident conclusion would need to be re-examined from the start. The investigator also noted that there were no records indicating any serious internal debate about the fixture's load-bearing capacity, nor any sign that a technical or mechanical expert had ever been considered for evaluation. That absence was not the result of individual oversight, but reflected how many cases were handled at the time, where technical factors were only examined if they directly contradicted the initial conclusion. In Margaret Hale's case, the wall-mounted metal fixture did not contradict the accident hypothesis, but seemed to reinforce it, and therefore, it was not questioned. When the new investigator re-raised the issue, they were not seeking new evidence in the traditional sense, but the absence of necessary questions in the past. The accident hypothesis, when closely analyzed, appeared as a structure built from unchallenged assumptions, making it more fragile when faced with modern investigative methods. The re-examination of the wall-mounted metal fixture was not driven by a sensational discovery, but by the recognition that a key scene element had been accepted without proof, and if the investigation was to move forward, that element needed to be brought into the light. The decision to retest the evidence was not made hastily, as it meant questioning an entire conclusion that had stood for decades, but that caution did not diminish its necessity. The wall-mounted metal fixture, once stored as a piece that had fulfilled its role, was now seen as an object needing to be heard again, not through intuition, but through testing and analysis. Pulling the evidence from storage meant more than a procedural step, as it marked the shift from accepting what had been concluded to checking how solidly those conclusions were founded. In that moment, Margaret Hale's case was no longer just an old file being reread, but became an open puzzle, where a detail overlooked in 1962 began demanding answers through data and logic, rather than familiarity and speculation, and from that point, the wall-mounted metal fixture, once seen as evidence of a simple accident, began to carry the weight of an unanswered question. The decision to re-examine the metal object attached to the wall inevitably led to one consequence. When a foundational hypothesis was called into question, all the data previously deemed insufficient also had to be re-evaluated in a new light, and in that process, the elements related to motive, which had been pushed to the margins of the 1962 investigation, began to gradually take on a different meaning. In the old file, information about Margaret Hale's life insurance policy appeared only as an administrative note, not emphasized or deeply analyzed, because at that time, her death had been classified as an accident, and financial factors, in that context, were not considered directly relevant. However, when the new investigators reviewed the documents, they realized that the value of the life insurance policy in Margaret's name had been increased in a period relatively close to the date of her death, a detail that had gone unnoticed because it was not accompanied by evidence of violence or clear conflict. Increasing the insurance, taken in isolation, was not unusual behavior, especially in the context of a family seeking to ensure financial security, but when placed alongside the timing of the death and the untested accident hypothesis, this detail began to take on a different tone, not as evidence, but as a piece of information that needed to be placed in its proper position. The investigators noted that in 1962, changes to life insurance policies were rarely seen as a strong enough motive to open a criminal investigation without clear signs of violence, because speculating on financial motive in an accident case could lead to subjective and unfounded conclusions. That was why this information had not been explored in depth, not because it did not exist, but because it did not fit within the pre-established framework of conclusions. In addition to the financial factor, the file also contained scattered notes about Leonard Hale's personal relationships, details that at the initial time were not considered significant because they were not accompanied by public disputes or conflicting statements. Leonard's extramarital affair, as recorded in the file, was not confirmed as a major disruption in family life, and certainly not directly linked to Margaret's death. In the social context of Alabama, in the early 1960s, such information was often handled with restraint, because bringing private life into a criminal investigation without concrete evidence could lead to unwanted legal and social consequences. The new investigators realized that the details about the extramarital affair had been seen as insufficient to challenge the accident hypothesis, and thus they existed in the file only as unemphasized lines of text. However, when the accident hypothesis was placed in a state requiring re-verification, these data no longer stood alone, but began to interact with each other in a different way, creating a more complex picture of the context surrounding Margaret's death. The increase in life insurance and the existence of an extramarital affair, if considered in a case where the cause of death had not been fully verified, could be interpreted as motive-creating factors, but the investigators were also very aware that motive, no matter how reasonable it appeared, could never replace evidence. This awareness led them back to the core question: why these data, though existing, were not enough to prosecute in 1962, and whether that circumstance would change when viewed from the present. The answer lay in the difference between suspicion and proof, between possibility and probability, a boundary that the justice system must respect. At the initial time, there was no forensic evidence indicating homicide, no physical tests refuting the accident hypothesis, and no statements or direct witnesses linking Leonard to a violent act, and in that context, using factors like insurance or an extramarital affair to build a criminal charge would not hold up in court. The new investigators understood that the motive data had not been ignored due to lack of informational value, but due to lack of legal value in a file already shaped by the accident conclusion. Placing them back at the center of attention was not aimed at rewriting history in an accusatory direction, but at better understanding how investigative decisions had been made within a specific logical framework. When examining the insurance-related documents, the investigators saw that the increase in policy value had been done in full compliance with legal procedures, with no signs of fraud, and not accompanied by other suspicious behavior at the time, a key factor making it impossible to view as evidence of malicious intent. Similarly, the information about Leonard's extramarital affair, though it might raise questions about marital life, provided no direct link to the circumstances of Margaret's death, and thus could not cross the threshold of speculation. The new investigators, when confronting these data, did not seek to turn them into evidence, but to understand their true role in the overall structure of the case. The details once deemed insufficient now were recognized as contextual factors, not to accuse, but to question whether the accident conclusion had caused the system to miss a full evaluation of potential underlying motives. The late emergence of motive in the review process did not change the reality that in 1962, they could not be used for legal prosecution, but it did show that the picture of Margaret Hale's death was more complex than what the initial file portrayed. The belated appearance of these factors was not sensational but methodological, as it emphasized that an investigation is shaped not only by what is found, but also by what is deemed strong enough to act upon. In the current context, placing the data about insurance and personal relationships into the same analytical framework as physical evidence, and the scene was not aimed at immediate conclusion, but at preparing for a different approach, where every assumption must be verified, and every factor, even those once seen as secondary, must be re-evaluated in relation to the core unanswered questions. The successive questioning of old assumptions pushed the review beyond the boundary of a purely administrative activity, forcing those involved to confront the possibility that the Margaret Hale file, once considered complete, might need to be reopened in the full legal sense of the term. When the wall-mounted metal object was no longer seen as the obvious explanation, when contextual factors like life insurance and extramarital affairs were placed in a new analytical framework, the next question became unavoidable. whether the initial forensic conclusions, made within the scientific limits of 1962, fully reflected what Margaret's body might have to say. For the investigators, this was not a simple decision, as reopening a closed case carried significant legal, ethical, and social consequences, requiring sufficiently strong grounds to justify interfering with a conclusion that had existed for decades. The initial discussions took place in private settings, where every detail was weighed not to seek a sensational scenario, but to determine whether there existed legal basis for continuing the investigation. The file was passed through the appropriate authorities, from investigation to prosecution, accompanied by cautious arguments about why the old assumptions needed to be retested with more modern scientific tools. Lawyers and prosecutors reviewed the file with a different eye than the investigators, focusing on whether there was enough reasonable cause to justify the next steps, because in the legal system, suspicion, no matter how reasonable, must be placed within strict procedural frameworks. Reopening the case could not be based on a feeling that something was amiss, but on the argument that previous conclusions might have been reached, based on assumptions not fully verified. In internal memos, the focus of the argument was not on accusing any individual, but on emphasizing that forensic science had advanced to the point where it could detect signs previously unrecognizable, and that refusing to reconsider those possibilities would mean permanently accepting the limitations of the past. One of the key questions raised was whether exhuming Margaret Hale's body could yield new information or would merely be an unnecessary intrusion into a settled conclusion. Forensic experts were consulted on the preservation of the body under burial conditions, on the types of traces that might still remain after many years, and on the scientific and legal risks of conducting a second autopsy. These opinions were not entirely uniform, as exhumation always carries uncertainty, but one common point stood out. If subtle injury traces existed, especially in areas not thoroughly examined in the first autopsy, only direct access to the body would allow their identification. The investigators realized that though this decision was invasive and sensitive, it was also the only path to answering whether 1962 forensics had missed something. The process of obtaining permission for exhumation followed proper legal procedures, with carefully drafted requests clearly stating the purpose, scope, and limits of the re-examination, to ensure the action was not seen as an unfounded evidence hunt. Margaret's family, having lived for years with the accident conclusion, was informed of the possibility of reopening the case, and their reactions reflected the conflict between the desire for complete answers and the fear of stirring up painful memories. For the legal system, family consent or opposition was not the sole deciding factor, but it was still considered as part of the ethical picture surrounding the decision. As the legal procedures were gradually completed, the exhumation decision was no longer a theoretical assumption, but a concrete action awaiting execution, and with it, the seriousness of the reinvestigation was elevated to a new level. The investigators understood that once the body was brought up from its resting place, there was no returning to the state of just reviewing the file, because any discovery, no matter how small, could completely change how Margaret Hale's death was understood. This decision was not made hastily, but with clear awareness that it imposed a great responsibility. If exhumation yielded no new information, the investigation would face questions about the necessity of disrupting a settled conclusion. If it did yield new information, the entire case would enter a different phase, where old assumptions no longer held value. In the final meetings before the decision was approved, the investigators returned to the original question that had started the whole process, whether the accident hypothesis was built on a sufficiently solid foundation. That question, now, could no longer be answered by rereading the file or analyzing stored evidence, but only by directly confronting the case's central evidence, Margaret Hale's body. When the exhumation order was officially issued, It was not viewed as an accusation, but as a necessary step to test the integrity of the old conclusion, and in that moment, the case, once considered closed, officially entered a new phase, where science and forensics were given a second chance to speak what the past had been unable to hear. The exhumation decision officially pushed the Margaret Hale case out of the safe zone of old assumptions, and when her body was brought up from its resting place after many years, no one involved considered this merely a supplementary formality. The entire reinvestigation process now depended on whether forensic science, with the tools and experience accumulated over decades, could detect something the initial autopsy had never seen. The atmosphere in the second autopsy room had a completely different tone from the first in 1962. No longer the haste to determine basic cause of death to decide whether to close or open the file, but a high level of focus on every small detail, every subtle sign that might exist beyond the reach of old methods. The forensic pathologists entered this process with clear awareness that they were in direct dialogue with the past, and every conclusion had to be solid enough to withstand rigorous scrutiny from both science and law. Margaret's body was handled with absolute respect, every step documented and compared to the old file, to determine not only what was newly discovered, but also what had been overlooked or misunderstood. The focus of the autopsy quickly shifted to areas of the body given little attention the first time, especially the neck and nape, where experts recognized that signs of restraint or intervention might exist without leaving obvious surface marks on the skin. As the soft tissue was carefully examined, faint bruises began to appear, deep under the skin in the neck-nape area, not prominent, not easily noticeable with ordinary observation, but clear enough to draw the attention of eyes trained to seek subtle abnormalities. These bruises were not randomly distributed, but concentrated in mechanically significant positions, where force from another person's hand or forearm could have been applied while holding or pressing the victim's head. The discovery of these bruises immediately changed how the pathologists viewed Margaret's entire death, as they did not fit the image of someone simply slipping in the bathroom. The experts began more thorough analysis to determine the nature of the bruises, from color and permeation to surrounding tissue reaction, to clarify when they formed. The analysis results showed the bruises appeared around the time of death, not as a product of natural decomposition or post-mortem handling, a critical conclusion, as it directly linked these traces to Margaret's final moments. In that context, the pathologists had to ask about the mechanism of bruise formation, as they required directed and sufficiently strong force, something unlikely if the victim had merely slipped and collided randomly. When the neck-nape bruises were placed alongside the drowning conclusion, a different scenario began to form, where water was no longer a random fatal factor, but a means used in an intentional act. The forensic experts considered the possibility that Margaret had been held with her head or neck underwater, an action that might not leave brain trauma or clear defensive marks, but enough to cause asphyxia and lead to drowning. This scenario explained the presence of the bruises as well as the absence of alcohol or drugs in the body, since a sober person could still be overpowered if attacked suddenly in a confined space like a bathroom. The internal discussions among the forensic pathologists proceeded with extreme caution, as they were aware that reinterpreting an old conclusion was not just a scientific matter but one of professional responsibility. They considered and ruled out every other possibility, from self-inflicted injury to impacts during transport or burial, but none provided a convincing explanation for the position, shape and characteristics of the bruises. This systematic elimination strengthened the conclusion that the neck-nape traces were most consistent with drowning, involving intervention by another person. When the second autopsy report was drafted, the language was cautious but clear, emphasizing that the new findings could not be reconciled with the previously accepted household accident hypothesis. The accident hypothesis, based on the combination of the bathroom scene and the initial drowning conclusion, began to collapse, not due to a single decisive piece of evidence, but because of the emergence of details no longer fitting the old argumentative structure. The investigators, upon receiving these results, realized that the foundation of the case had fundamentally changed, as it was now impossible to continue explaining Margaret Hale's death without accounting for the possibility of deliberate human intervention. The neck-nape bruises, once invisible in the old file, became the pivot for a completely different understanding of the event, not only questioning how Margaret died, but also the context and the people around her in that moment. The second forensic report did not name any suspect, but it did something even more important at this stage. It shattered the false certainty of the accident conclusion, opening space for a true criminal investigation. In that moment, the Margaret Hale case was no longer an explained tragedy, but an unresolved death awaiting justice, where science finally had spoken to say that what was once seen as obvious might have concealed a far more serious truth. The findings from the second autopsy fundamentally altered the understanding of Margaret Hale's death, and when the accident hypothesis no longer held up, the focus of the reinvestigation naturally turned back to the piece of evidence that had once played a central role in shaping the original conclusion, the wall-mounted metal fixture believed to have come loose in that fateful moment. Bringing this evidence back into the spotlight was not merely symbolic, it was an inevitable step, because if the entire accident argument had rested on its physical feasibility, then that very feasibility had to be tested using methods that were not applied in 1962. Before any testing could take place, the investigators and technical experts had to confront a basic but no less important question: how had this evidence been preserved over the decades, and was its current condition still intact enough to accurately reflect what had happened? The archival records were opened, documenting the process of sealing, numbering, and storing the wall-mounted metal fixture, along with related components, and notably, this evidence had never been removed from storage for in-depth analysis, as its role was considered fulfilled the moment the case was closed. When the evidence was retrieved from storage, its external condition was thoroughly examined, with every scratch and every point of deformation recorded and compared to crime scene photographs from years ago to determine whether any changes had occurred during preservation. The experts found that despite the long passage of time, the metal fixture retained its overall shape and the main damage characteristics, an important factor because it allowed subsequent mechanical analyses to be based on a structure as close to the original as possible. The wall-mounted portion, with its signs of deformation, became the focal point of attention, as it was here that questions about the direction and intensity of the force began to be seriously raised. The preservation check was not only to confirm the integrity of the evidence, but also to rule out the possibility that the observed deformations were the result of later storage or handling, rather than traces of the original event. When the experts concluded that the current condition of the evidence matched what had been recorded at the scene, the next step became clearer than ever: preparing for a series of mechanical tests to examine the feasibility of the accident hypothesis. This preparation process was not rushed, as the investigators understood that the results of the upcoming tests would have far-reaching implications for the entire direction of the investigation, and any errors in preparation could undermine their value. The technical specifications of the wall-mounted metal fixture were redetermined in detail, from the material, dimensions and thickness, to the method of attachment to the wall, as each of these factors directly affected its load-bearing capacity. This information, which had not been deemed necessary in the initial investigation, now became the foundation for designing scientifically meaningful tests. The experts also compared the evidence to similar samples used in the same era to determine whether this metal fixture had any distinguishing features and whether it was designed to withstand a level of force beyond what an average person could generate. Test preparation was not just a technical issue, but also a methodological one, as the investigators had to decide how to reconstruct the assumed accident scenario without distorting real-world conditions. They discussed the use of test models, the application of force in different directions, and the precise measurement of the force intensity needed to produce deformations similar to those on the evidence. These discussions reflected a profound shift in the approach to the case, from accepting an intuitive explanation to requiring every assumption to be verified with data. During preparation, the investigators were also fully aware that the mechanical tests were not intended to prove a specific scenario, but to answer a basic question: whether the previously accepted accident scenario was physically feasible. If the metal fixture could not be dislodged under the described conditions, the accident hypothesis would lose its physical foundation, no matter how intuitive it seemed. Conversely, if the test showed that dislodging the fixture was entirely possible in a slip-and-fall situation, the reinvestigation would face different questions about the significance of the new forensic findings. It was this balance that made the test preparation process particularly cautious, as the results, whichever way they went, would be decisive. The investigators ensured that every preparation step was documented in detail, from handling the evidence to selecting measurement equipment, to guarantee that the subsequent tests could be replicated and independently verified if needed. Bringing the evidence back was not just a procedural act but a shift in investigative philosophy, where what had once been taken as obvious now had to withstand the challenge of science. In that context, the wall-mounted metal fixture was no longer a supporting detail in a story already told, but became a central object required to speak through numbers, forces, and deformations rather than speculation. When the preparation steps were complete, the investigators realized they were standing on the threshold of a new phase in the reinvestigation, where old assumptions would be weighed against experimental data. And the outcome of this process would determine whether Margaret Hale's death could continue to be explained as a tragic accident or would have to be recognized as an intentional act concealed by what had once appeared harmless. Bringing the wall-mounted metal fixture back to the center of the investigation led directly to the most critical phase of the entire review process, where the accident hypothesis was no longer evaluated by intuitive plausibility, but had to confront the uncompromising laws of physics. The mechanical tests were designed with the sole purpose of determining whether the scenario accepted for decades was feasible, and to achieve that, every factor related to Margaret Hale's physical condition, the bathroom space, and the structure of the metal fixture had to be incorporated into the simulation as accurately as possible. Test participants were selected based on parameters similar to the victim: height, weight, reach, and average strength, to ensure that the force generated during testing did not exceed what Margaret could have produced in real conditions. The technical experts reconstructed a model mounting the metal fixture to a wall surface with equivalent structure and material, using the same type of screws and attachment depth as determined from the evidence, because even small deviations in these details could alter the results. When the tests began, pulling force was applied exactly as in the accident scenario assumed since 1962, a reflexive force in the moment of slipping, where the victim reached out to grab the towel rack to regain balance. The initial pulls were performed with gradually increasing force, simulating the natural reaction of someone suddenly losing balance, but the results produced no significant displacement of the metal fixture, let alone dislodging it from the wall. Subsequent tests attempted to recreate variations of the situation, from downward pulls to horizontal ones and different angles, to rule out the possibility that the original force direction had been misassumed, but in every case, the metal fixture remained in place, sustaining only minor deformations inconsistent with the damage recorded on the original evidence. Participants were instructed to use their full body weight within safe limits, simulating a genuine panic situation, but even when the pulling force was pushed to the maximum that a person of equivalent build could generate, the metal fixture still did not come loose, and this began to create a clear disconnect between the accident hypothesis and physical reality. Force measuring devices were used to accurately record the impact intensity in each attempt, and the data showed that the force required to produce damage similar to that on the evidence far exceeded what could be generated in an ordinary slip and fall. This realization forced the experts to expand the scope of testing, not to salvage the accident hypothesis, but to determine under what conditions the metal fixture could be dislodged. The next tests were designed with more deliberate force application, using both hands and applying force in a calculated rather than reflexive manner, and only under these conditions did the metal fixture begin to show signs of displacement and eventually come loose from the wall. The difference between the two groups of tests became clear. In the accident scenario, where force was generated in a brief moment without stable footing, the metal fixture did not come loose. In the intentional scenario, where force was applied continuously, directed, and sufficiently strong, the damage began to appear in a way comparable to the original evidence. The experts noted that recreating the level of deformation observed on the case fixture required a force exceeding the natural reflexive capability of someone slipping and falling, and that force had to be applied in a specific direction inconsistent with the victim's posture in the accident scenario. These results were not drawn from a single test, but from a series of repeated, tightly controlled trials to eliminate errors and ensure consistency. Each failed attempt to recreate the accident scenario further reinforced the conclusion that the hypothesis did not hold up to experimental scrutiny, and the consistency of the results virtually eliminated the possibility of chance. The investigators monitoring this process realized they were no longer facing an interpretive debate, but a set of objective data pointing to one conclusion: the accident as described for years could not have happened. The inability to recreate the accident based on the original account did not merely weaken a hypothesis, it collapsed the entire argumentative structure built around it, because if the metal fixture could not be dislodged in a slip and fall, the bathroom scene no longer supported the accident scenario. The technical experts presented their conclusions with the necessary caution, emphasizing that the tests were not intended to recreate every exact detail of the event, but to examine the physical feasibility of the hypothesis, and on that basis, the results were clear and consistent. An accident by its physical definition in this context could not produce what was observed on the evidence. This forced the investigation to confront an unavoidable reality. If an accident could not have occurred, then another factor, active and intentional, had to be considered to explain the scene. This conclusion was not reached with excitement or a sense of triumph, but with a heavy awareness of its consequences, as it entailed re-examining the entire story of Margaret Hale's death and the role of those around her. In the moment the test results were compiled and placed on the investigation team's desk, a clear line was drawn between what had once been accepted for convenience and what science permitted, and on the other side of that line, the accident hypothesis no longer had a place. Ruling out the accident hypothesis on physical grounds did not end the testing process. On the contrary, it opened an even more important question for the reinvestigation. If the wall-mounted metal fixture could not be dislodged in a natural slip and fall, then how had it been subjected to the force that produced the deformations recorded on the original evidence? From this point, the tests were elevated to another level, not to answer whether an accident could have happened, but to precisely determine the direction of force applied in the event that led to Margaret Hale's death. The technical experts returned to the evidence, this time viewing it not merely as an object to be dislodged, but as a physical record preserving traces of the action exerted upon it. Every bend, every small crack, every sign of deformation on the mounting portion and the metal body was analyzed to determine the direction and nature of the impacting force, because in mechanics, materials respond not only to force intensity, but to the direction in which it is applied. When these data were compared to the previous test results, a clear incompatibility emerged between the slip and fall hypothesis and the shape of the deformations on the evidence. The deformations on the metal did not show signs of a downward pull from inside the bathtub, the logical force direction if Margaret had reached for the towel rack while losing balance, but instead suggested an outward pull with more stable footing and longer application time. This realization compelled the experts to design a new series of tests focused not on recreating the slip and fall, but on recreating different force directions that could produce deformations similar to those on the evidence. The test models were adjusted to allow force application from multiple positions, including from outside the bathtub, where a person could stand firmly, plant their feet securely, and use full body strength to pull the metal fixture from the wall. When force was applied in this direction, the results changed dramatically, not only in the fixture coming loose, but in how it came loose. The deformations produced in these tests showed striking similarity to the original evidence, from the curved shape of the mounting portion to the location and type of metal cracks, details that could not be recreated in the accident simulation tests. The experts noted that producing such deformations required an outward and slightly upward pulling force, a direction unlikely to occur if the victim was inside the bathtub, trying to save herself, but entirely consistent with a scenario of someone standing outside the tub, using their feet as leverage and yanking the fixture toward them. Determining the force direction was not just technical, it meant reconstructing the scene in a completely different way from the story that had existed for years. In this new scenario, the metal fixture was no longer the tool the victim desperately grabbed, but an object manipulated afterward, as part of an effort to create a scene consistent with an accident hypothesis. Subsequent tests were conducted to verify the consistency of this conclusion, with multiple repetitions and minor variations in standing position, pull angle, and force intensity, but in most cases, only when force was applied from outside the bathtub did the deformations match the original evidence. This allowed the experts to almost completely rule out the possibility that the fixture was dislodged by Margaret's actions during a slip and fall, as not only the force intensity, but the direction was incompatible with that scenario. The investigators following this analysis realized they were witnessing a complete reversal of the scene, where what had once been seen as evidence of an accident now became an indicator of intentional action. The determination that the evidence was yanked from outside the bathtub carried an unavoidable logical consequence. If the force came from outside, someone must have been standing in that position when the fixture was dislodged. The scene, previously understood as the result of a random chain of events, began to be reconstructed as a space where deliberate actions had taken place, each leaving physical traces that only scientific analysis could read. The reversal of the scene did not happen in a dramatic moment, but in the slow process of comparing data, where each small detail reinforced an increasingly clear new picture. The experts concluded that the determined force direction not only contradicted the accident hypothesis, but strongly suggested that the metal fixture had been manipulated as part of staging the scene rather than as the cause of death. This meant the original story had been completely inverted. Instead of Margaret slipping and pulling the fixture loose, it was far more likely the fixture was pulled loose after the main event to create a plausible explanation for the death in the bathtub. When this conclusion was placed alongside the forensic findings of bruising in the neck occipital area, a disturbing compatibility between the data began to emerge, as both pointed to a scenario involving active human intervention. The scene, once viewed as evidence of accident, was now completely reversed, becoming evidence of staging. For the investigation, this was not just a technical discovery, but a structural turning point, as it shifted the focus from ruling out accident to reconstructing intentional action, and from explaining the death to identifying who might have been standing outside the bathtub in that decisive moment. The complete reversal of the crime scene, following the advanced experiments, turned what had once been a routine matter into a mandatory step in the reinvestigation. The entire testimony recorded in 1962 had to be reopened, reread, and compared detail by detail with what science had just proven to be possible or impossible. The investigators were not looking for a lie in the ordinary sense, because Leonard Hale's testimony had long been known for its consistency, with few changes and always presented in the same sequence. What they were seeking was compatibility between that story and the physical reality of the scene, as it had been reconstructed using data. When the transcript was placed on the table, every word began to carry a completely different weight than it had years before, because when a foundational hypothesis collapses, every detail that had clung to it must also be re-examined. Leonard had described that morning as proceeding normally, that he left the house in a state with nothing unusual, that Margaret stayed home, and that the incident was only discovered when her body was found in the bathtub, with the wall-mounted metal fixture having come loose, as a visual trace of a slip and fall. In the context of 1962, the detail of the fixture coming loose did the most important work. It turned an inexplicable death into an understandable story, while making Leonard's testimony align with the scene. But when science showed that the fixture could not have come loose from a reflexive slip and fall, and especially could not have come loose in a direction of force consistent with the posture of a victim inside the bathtub, that detail ceased to be an explanation and became a point of conflict. The investigators began asking questions at a mechanical level. In Leonard's testimony, what action by Margaret led to the fixture coming loose, from what position was the force generated, and in what direction did that force travel? These questions did not exist in the original investigation, because there was no data then to pose them, but now they were the key to testing the entire story. The results of the advanced experiments showed that to produce similar deformation on the physical evidence, the force had to be applied in a direction pulling outward from the bathtub, with a stable point of leverage and a duration of application longer than a normal fall reflex. In other words, the fixture had been yanked from outside. When this conclusion was compared to Leonard's testimony, the contradiction became unavoidable. In his story, the fixture coming loose was the consequence of a spontaneous action from the victim. In physical reality, the fixture could only come loose through a deliberate action, and from a specific position outside the tub. This was not the kind of contradiction that could be explained by misremembering or mixing up details, because it was a contradiction between the account and the laws of physics. From here, Leonard's testimony began to be refuted in the true scientific sense. There was no need to prove he was lying, only to prove that the scenario he described could not occur. The investigators continued comparing other parts of the testimony with the forensic findings. The second autopsy had discovered bruising in the neck-nape area consistent with restraint and drowning. This trace required direct intervention on a part of the body that an accidental slip and fall would struggle to produce. When the two independent sets of data, forensic and mechanical, were placed side by side, they complemented each other in a way that completely collapsed the accident narrative. Forensics said there were signs of restraint. Mechanics said the accident scene had been staged with a force that could not have originated from the victim. Leonard's testimony, which relied on the fixture as the cause of the accident, now became a story desperately clinging to a detail that science proved could not have happened in the way described. The investigators turned back to Leonard's famous consistency. In 1962, that consistency was seen as evidence of sincerity. He did not change his story, did not falter, did not contradict himself. But under the new light, consistency began to be viewed differently, because a story repeated unchanged could be a true memory, or it could be a fixed script. The difference lies in whether it aligns with objective evidence. When objective evidence changes, a true memory often reveals gaps, uncertain details, or the natural human adjustment when facing new facts, while a fixed script often remains unchanged, because it was built to serve a specific purpose. The investigators did not draw psychological conclusions here, but they noted that Leonard's testimony left no room for adjustment, and that only highlighted the gap between the account and physical reality. They began reading the testimony as a sequence of actions, not as a story. Leonard leaves the house. Margaret is last seen at home. There are no witnesses to Margaret leaving. The body is discovered in the bathtub. The loose fixture is used as the central explanation. In the accident structure, these points could connect. In the new structure built by science, they took on a different shape. Leaving the house created a time window. The victim not leaving the house made the indoor scene central. The fixture being yanked from outside indicated someone standing there, and the neck-nape bruising indicated restraint. When these points were reconnected in the new way, Leonard's sequence of behavior gradually became locked by the compatibility among objective data. The investigators also revisited how Leonard emphasized the fixture in his testimony, the level of confidence in using it to explain the accident, the way he described it as obvious evidence, and realized that detail was not just a scene observation, but the pillar of the story he told. If that pillar was removed, the entire testimony no longer stood at its most critical point, explaining why Margaret died in that position without signs of struggle. Once again, they did not need Leonard to confess or change his story. They only needed to show that the story relied on a physical event that could not occur as he described. In criminal investigation, this is a particularly dangerous form of refutation for a potential suspect, because it does not depend on the listener's perception, but on independently verifiable data. When the comparison process was complete, the investigators had not only a conclusion that an accident was impossible, but a tighter one. The 1962 testimony had been refuted by science, and when placed alongside the forensic findings, it was no longer just an unchallenged story, but a series of details irreconcilable with what the scene and the victim's body actually revealed. Leonard's sequence of behavior, from creating a time window to tightly anchoring the story to the loose fixture, was now fixed in a new logical framework, where every detail faced the pressure of objective data, and could no longer be explained by coincidence or accident. When the sequence of behavior was tightly locked by the cold compatibility of scientific and forensic data, the reinvestigation no longer stood on the boundary between suspicion and hypothesis, but moved into a phase requiring a clear legal decision, where every conclusion had to be accountable to courtroom standards of proof, rather than just investigative logic. The file was transferred to the prosecutor, in a form completely different from what had existed decades earlier. No longer a set of papers recording an unfortunate household accident, but an argumentative structure built from multiple layers of independent evidence, supporting each other in a way that was difficult to refute. The prosecutor approached the file not with the excitement of a belated discovery, but with the caution characteristic of someone who understood that every prosecution decision in an old case must face harsh challenges, from faded witness memories to the natural skepticism of a jury toward conclusions reached after many years. For that reason, completing the indictment did not happen in a single step, but was the result of repeated reviews, where each piece of evidence was weighed not only for its scientific value, but for its ability to hold up in an adversarial trial. The prosecutor began by examining the new forensic findings, especially the neck-nape bruising determined to be consistent with restraint and drowning, because this directly challenged the accident conclusion and provided a medical foundation for the homicide hypothesis. These findings were evaluated in the context of methodology, with the question of whether they were reliable enough to convince a jury that this was not hindsight interpretation, but the reasonable application of modern techniques and expertise. In parallel, the prosecutor reviewed the series of mechanical experiments that ruled out an accident, where the wall-mounted fixture not only could not have come loose in a slip and fall, but clearly showed forced direction from outside the bathtub, a detail with intentional scene reconstruction implications. The fact that these two branches of evidence, forensic and mechanical, were independent yet converged on the same conclusion became a crucial pillar for the prosecution decision, as it significantly reduced the risk that the entire case rested on a single assumption. The prosecutor continued reviewing Leonard Hale's 1962 testimony, not to look for changes in the account, but to assess the degree of contradiction between that testimony and the new scientific conclusions. In the draft indictment, the testimony was not presented as evidence of direct deceit, but as a story refuted by physical reality, an approach that avoided falling into subjective psychological debates and focused on what could be proven. Contextual factors like the life insurance and Leonard's extramarital relationship were considered with special caution, because although they were not sufficient to constitute the crime, they could be used to explain motive within the limits allowed by law, as long as they were not elevated to substitute for evidence of the act. The prosecutor was well aware that in a late case like this, overusing motive could backfire, so the indictment's focus was kept firmly on the actions inferable from physical evidence. As the indictment structure took shape, the key question was no longer whether Leonard had a motive, but whether there was sufficient scientific and forensic basis to prove that Margaret Hale died due to the intentional act of another person, and that Leonard was the only one present and capable of committing that act within the established time frame. The prosecutor thoroughly reviewed the legal standards necessary for prosecuting a murder case, especially the requirements for cause of death and the causal link between the alleged act and the death. The second autopsy reports were analyzed to ensure the language was clear enough to affirm consistency with drowning, yet cautious enough to avoid claims exceeding the data. The mechanical experiment conclusions were presented as results of physical feasibility testing, an approach that helped the jury understand that this was not speculation, but systematic elimination based on scientific laws. In completing the indictment, the prosecutor also considered anticipated defense counter-arguments, especially claims that evidence had degraded over time, or that the new conclusions were merely alternative interpretations of old data. To counter this, the indictment emphasized the independence and consistency of the new findings, as well as how they explained contradictions that the prior accident conclusion could not. The decision to prosecute was not made as an emotional reaction to a late discovery, but as a logical outcome of meeting the necessary evidentiary threshold to bring the case to trial. When the final documents were signed, the prosecutor knew they were entering a difficult legal battle, where time would be used as a weapon by the defense, but they also knew that failing to prosecute in this context would mean accepting that science and forensics, despite pointing to an intentional death, were still not strong enough to overturn a wrong conclusion. The prosecution decision, therefore, was not just a legal step, but a statement of principle, that truth does not lose value simply because it is discovered late. When the indictment was officially completed, it was not seen as the end of the re-investigation, but as the door opening to the next phase, where every conclusion would have to be tested in the public light of trial, and where what science had revealed would face the harshest challenge of the justice system. The decision to prosecute turned the entire re-investigation process, which for many years had existed only on paper and in closed meetings, into an irreversible legal action, and when the indictment was officially approved, the next step followed with cold inevitability. Leonard Hale had to be arrested. The arrest warrant was issued not as a attention-grabbing move, but as a logical continuation of the chain of conclusions built through science, forensics, and rigorous comparison between testimony and the scene, because the prosecutors understood that in a case spanning decades, any procedural deviation could become a fatal weakness. Leonard was no longer a figure from an old reopened file, but an official defendant, directly facing charges that had hung unnamed in legal limbo for many years. The moment law enforcement officers came for Leonard carried special meaning, because it was not tied to the old scene or any tense situation, but occurred in the context of a normal life built and maintained over decades. Leonard had lived long enough to believe that the 1962 accident story had been permanently accepted, that all questions had been answered, and that his role in Margaret's death existed only as a sad memory no one wanted to unearth. For that reason, the moment the arrest warrant was read did not need harsh words to create impact, because its content alone was enough to collapse a reality Leonard had relied on for most of his life. The officers carried out the arrest with professional standard, no confrontation, no outward drama, but every action carried the meaning of a direct connection between the present and the alleged act in the distant past. Leonard did not attempt to flee, nor did he react violently, but his silence in that moment was later recalled by many as a sign of psychological impact, where a person was forced to confront the possibility that what had been considered legally safe no longer existed. Leonard being led away was not just a formal deprivation of freedom, but a complete reversal of his social position, from a sympathetic widower to a defendant in a concealed murder. News of the arrest quickly spread beyond official channels, not due to intentional leaks, but because the unusual nature of the event made it impossible to contain. A person arrested for a death decades earlier always provokes strong reactions, because it challenges the community's sense of stability about past and present. For those who lived in Alabama in 1962, the arrest felt like an old memory being yanked from its familiar place, forcing them to re-examine what they had believed to be true. Many could not believe that a case classified as an accident for so many years could lead to arresting a suspect after all that time, and that very disbelief created a widespread wave of shock. The community's reaction was not uniform, because collective memory of Leonard had been built over years with different layers of meaning, from the image of a man quietly living with a painful past to one who had normally reintegrated into society. The arrest not only challenged that image, but raised uncomfortable questions for many: how many closed stories had never truly been understood correctly. Media outlets quickly accessed the information, not to exploit personal lives, but to understand what had changed strongly enough to make the justice system act after decades of silence. In initial reports, the focus was not on sensational details, but on the very factor of time, on the question of why now, rather than earlier, Leonard Hale was arrested. The answer, though not yet fully presented to the public, lay in advances in forensic science and the systematic elimination of old assumptions, but for many, that did not reduce the feeling of disorientation when witnessing a familiar order overturned. For the investigators, the moment of Leonard's arrest brought no sense of satisfaction or victory, because they knew this was merely the transition point between investigation and trial, and that their conclusions would now face harsh courtroom scrutiny. However, they also clearly recognized that failing to proceed with the arrest in this context would be a betrayal of the very data they had painstakingly built, because science and forensics had shown that Margaret's death could not be explained as an accident. Leonard was brought into the legal process as a defendant, and every subsequent procedure, from fingerprinting to temporary detention filing, carried deep symbolic meaning, because it marked the first time since 1962 that he was viewed by the legal system as someone criminally accountable. For the surrounding community, the arrest was not just news about an individual, but a reminder that time does not protect anyone from re-examination when new truth emerges. Many began discussing not only Leonard, but the case itself, how an accident hypothesis could persist so long unchallenged, and the role of science in overturning seemingly unchangeable conclusions. The shock did not come from Leonard being handcuffed, but from the community having to accept that a death once seen as random was now viewed as intentional, and that a person who had lived in the safe shadow of that conclusion now had to face legal consequences. The arrest, therefore, was not just an event in the case's timeline, but a symbolic milestone, where past and present collided head-on, and where the community's long-held beliefs were forced to be reconsidered under the light of science and law. In the moment Leonard Hale was taken away, the Margaret Hale case was no longer a story of a tragedy that had lain dormant, but became a living testament to the fact that truth, though buried for decades, can still rise strongly enough to shake an entire community that believed everything had long been resolved. The arrest of Leonard Hale pushed the entire story out of the realm of investigation and into the most public and unforgiving space of the justice system, where every conclusion, no matter how carefully constructed, had to withstand direct challenge through legal argument and the judgment of a jury. The trial did not open with dramatic accusations, but with a foundational question posed from the very beginning: whether modern science was powerful enough to overturn a statement that had been accepted for decades. The prosecution understood that they were not just trying Leonard Hale, but asking the jury to accept a far more uncomfortable truth: that a death once considered an accident might have been a murder concealed by the limitations of science at the time. The defense focused on what they believed was the case's greatest weakness: time, emphasizing that all new conclusions were reached too late, when human memories had faded and no direct witnesses remained who could confirm or refute the hypotheses presented. They argued that Leonard's 1962 statement, though imperfect, was still the only account recorded closest to the time of the event, and that using science to rewrite the past risked turning speculation into conclusion. In response to this argument, the prosecution did not counter with emotion, but with the logical structure of the case, stressing that the trial was not a confrontation between memory and speculation, but between a statement and what could or could not physically happen according to the laws of physics. When forensic experts were called to testify, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably, as the jury heard for the first time a detailed explanation of the bruises on Margaret Hale's neck and nape, how they were discovered during the second autopsy, and why they could not be explained by an ordinary slip and fall. The experts presented their findings in careful language, avoiding absolute assertions, but every statement pointed toward the same conclusion: these marks were consistent with restraint and drowning, and inconsistent with a household accident. The defense attempted to undermine the reliability of this conclusion by questioning the possibility of decomposition and distortion over the years, but the experts countered that the location and characteristics of the bruises were the key factors, not their freshness, and that no reasonable scenario other than intervention by another person could fully explain those signs. When it was the turn of the mechanics experts to testify, the debate between science and the statement became more direct than ever, as the jury now heard not only about what might have happened to the victim's body, but about what could not have happened at the bathroom scene. The simulation experiments were presented in detail, from selecting individuals with physiques comparable to Margaret's to measuring impact forces, and most importantly, the conclusion that the wall-mounted metal fixture could not have been dislodged in the way Leonard had described. The experts explained that to produce the observed deformation on the evidence, a pulling force directed from outside the bathtub was required, with a stable pivot point, something impossible if the victim was inside and reacting in the moment of a fall. The defense tried to redirect the argument toward potential error margins in the experiments, asking whether some rare scenario might exist that science had not yet replicated, but the consistent repetition of the test results weakened this line of reasoning. The jury was guided through each logical step, not to believe a new hypothesis, but to understand why the old one no longer held up. When Leonard's 1962 statement was directly compared to the scientific conclusions, the contradiction became clear in a way that required no harsh words. The statement relied on a physical event that could not occur. The prosecution emphasized that they were not asking the jury to believe Leonard lied for personal motives, but to accept that the story told did not align with the proven physical reality. This was the pivotal point of the trial, as it shifted the focus from evaluating the defendant's character to evaluating the feasibility of what the defendant described. In the final arguments, the defense returned to the element of time, warning the jury of the danger of convicting someone based on evidence interpreted late, but the prosecution responded by arguing that science is not bound by time in the way human memory is, and that late discovery does not diminish the value of truth. The jury listened in silence, understanding that their decision affected not only Leonard Hale's fate, but also the broader question of how the justice system should respond when science reveals an old conclusion may have been wrong. When the experts completed their testimony, there was little room left for reasonable doubt in the legal sense, as the independent pieces, forensic, mechanical, and the statement had converged on the same conclusion. The jury's deliberation did not unfold in chaos, but in quiet tension, where each member had to answer for themselves whether they could continue believing in the accident hypothesis when science had shown it impossible. It was the persuasion that came not from emotion, but from the consistency of the data, that gradually tipped the scales toward the prosecution. When the jury returned to the courtroom, their decision reflected not anger or a desire for punishment, but an acceptance that what had once been considered truth no longer stood up to the light of science. The trial, therefore, was not just a place to adjudicate a murder case, but a place where science and testimony were publicly weighed against each other, and in this confrontation, the limitations of the earlier testimony were exposed. The silence that enveloped the courtroom after the jury concluded its deliberation carried a different weight from every moment before it, because everyone understood that the decision about to be announced would not only close a trial, but redefine the entire meaning of a death that occurred more than half a century earlier. When the jury returned, their faces showed neither triumph nor hesitation, but the weariness of people who had just confronted a complex truth, where time, science and moral responsibility were tightly intertwined. The verdict was read slowly, in keeping with procedure, and when the words guilty rang out, they did not provoke a loud stir, but cut cleanly through the already tense atmosphere, because by that point, many in the room understood that this conclusion was the logical outcome of what had been presented. Leonard Hale was convicted not because of an impulsive emotional moment by the jury, but because the chain of scientific and forensic evidence had surpassed the threshold of reasonable doubt, forcing the justice system to acknowledge that Margaret Hale's death could no longer be considered an accident. As the judge affirmed the verdict, his voice procedural yet unable to hide its gravity, Leonard stood still, showing no marked reaction, but his status shifted instantly from defendant to convicted man, an irreversible legal transition. In the hours and days that followed, discussions centered on the possibility of reaching a plea agreement, not to deny the verdict, but to determine an appropriate sentencing framework in the context of an unusual case, where the alleged act occurred long ago, and many personal circumstances had changed over time. The prosecution, though having secured a guilty verdict, carefully weighed accepting a plea, understanding that the core goal of the case was not the maximum sentence, but officially redefining the truth and recording criminal responsibility. The defense, facing the reality that avenues for appeal based on scientific doubt had been significantly narrowed, considered a plea as a way to avoid prolonging a legal process whose outcome was unlikely to change. In these exchanges, the focus was no longer on whether Leonard committed the crime, since the jury had determined that, but on how the justice system should respond to a crime exposed so late. When a plea agreement was offered, if it occurred, it carried a formal acknowledgement that Margaret Hale's death resulted from murder, no longer a regrettable household accident, as the old records had noted. Leonard's acceptance of such a plea would not be seen as an emotional confession, but as a legal acknowledgement before irrefutable evidence, a step to close the case within the bounds of the law. When the final sentence was pronounced, whether through the court's verdict or a plea agreement, it marked the first time since 1962 that Margaret Hale's death was officially designated as murder in the state's legal records. This change was not merely terminological, but carried profound historical and moral significance, correcting a distortion that had persisted for decades, recognizing that a human life had been taken by intentional act, not random coincidence. For Leonard, the sentence was not just the loss of freedom, but the complete collapse of the story that had protected him for most of his life, the story of an accident no one could be blamed for. For the justice system, this verdict affirmed that time does not nullify justice, and that the scientific limitations of the past are not reason to maintain a wrong conclusion when the truth has been clarified. The reaction in the courtroom after the verdict was announced was not explosive, but subdued, because those present understood they were witnessing the end of a long journey, where justice did not arrive quickly, but ultimately did. The case file was updated, documents revised to reflect the new conclusion, and the name Margaret Hale, once tied to an accident, was now recorded in legal history as the victim of a murder. Redesignating the case carried consequences beyond the individual sentence, as it forced authorities to re-examine how similar cases in the past might have been misjudged, and underscored the role of science in correcting those errors. As the trial concluded, there was no sense of complete victory, because no sentence could restore lost time or erase the years the truth was hidden, but the verdict still carried undeniable meaning. It put an end to a false story and replaced it with a verified truth, recognizing that Margaret Hale's death was no longer submerged in the silence of an accident, but properly named as murder, with all its accompanying legal and moral consequences. The court's verdict did not close the case in the familiar way people expect, but unleashed a wave of aftershocks that spread throughout the Alabama community, where the name Margaret Hale had once been associated with a tragedy, spoken of with regret, now mentioned again with a completely different feeling, heavier, harder to accept. For decades, the story of Margaret's death existed as a sad accident, an unwanted household mishap, and that very labeling had allowed the community to set it aside, as a sorrowful memory, but one that did not disrupt the shared moral order. When the case was officially redesignated as murder, that calm was shattered, because it meant the community had to confront an uncomfortable truth. A homicide had existed in their everyday lives for decades, without being recognized. The initial reaction was shock, not because of the violence of the act, which occurred quietly in private, but because of the duration of the concealment, for time here was not just years past, but years a collective belief had been built on a false assumption. Many who lived through the 1962 era began to revisit their memories differently, recalling stories told at dinner tables, whispers about the bathroom accident, and now realizing that that very normalization had inadvertently created a shield for a crime. In informal conversations, the question was not only what Leonard Hale had done, but how a community could live peacefully for years without knowing the truth lay just beneath the surface of an administrative conclusion. For younger people, who knew the case only through news or second-hand accounts, the aftermath took the form of a cognitive jolt, because it challenged the belief that serious incidents from the past had been resolved conclusively, that the legal system always had the capacity to distinguish accident from crime from the start. The shift from accident to murder was not just a change in terminology, but a fundamental change in how the community understood safety, trust, and what might be overlooked when science and investigative methods were limited. Local and national media covered the case not sensationally, but in a subdued tone, because the nature of the story itself carried enough weight. A woman dying in her bathroom, a husband living his life with an accident story, and a community learning the truth only when it was too late to remedy the years of silence. Analyses focused not just on Leonard or the trial, but on the broader question of how many other past cases might have been misunderstood for similar reasons, creating a pervasive unease, where people began to view old accidents with greater skepticism. For the Alabama community, the Margaret Hale case became an unwanted symbol of how familiarity can dull vigilance, because when a story is repeated long enough, it ceases to be questioned, even if it contains logical gaps. Many felt a vague collective guilt, not for directly causing anything, but for accepting a comfortable explanation instead of asking hard questions, and that feeling grew stronger upon realizing the truth had to wait for science to advance enough to speak for itself. Community discussions extended beyond the specific case to deeper issues about how society handles death, how events in private spaces are easily overlooked, and the role of science in challenging entrenched assumptions. For many, the aftermath came not from Leonard's conviction, but from realizing a murder could be hidden, not by dramatic sophistication, but by the normalization of an accident story. Those who knew Leonard or his family had to confront a rupture in perception, placing the image of a familiar person alongside irrefutable scientific conclusions, and that rupture was not easily mended, because it forced acceptance that personal understanding could be entirely wrong before objective truth. The community also began re-examining how the legal system and investigative agencies operated in the past, not to assign blame, but to understand the limitations that led to a murder being mislabeled for years, and from that to set new expectations for reviewing other old files. The case became a collective reminder that justice is not just delivering a verdict, but an ongoing process of self-examination and correction when enough data exists to do so. As the aftershocks subsided, what remained was not prolonged outrage, but a contemplative state, where the community had to live with the awareness that the past is not always understood correctly when it happens. Margaret Hale's death, once minimized as a household mishap, was now seen as a long crack in local history, a crack only recognized when it had spread enough to be impossible to ignore. And in that belated recognition, the Alabama community had to face an unavoidable truth. Sometimes the most shocking thing is not the crime itself, but the time that crime was allowed to exist under a different name, silent, familiar, and unquestioned. The community aftershocks gradually subsided to make way for a different, quieter, but more enduring need, the need to fully understand why a murder could remain concealed for decades under the guise of an accident, and the answer, when viewed calmly, lay not in an elaborate conspiracy spanning years, but in the intersection of the scientific limitations of an era and the dangerous persuasiveness of reasonable assumptions. The perpetrator nearly escaped justice not because the legal system turned a blind eye, but because in 1962, every important piece seemed to fit together well enough that no one felt the need to break that structure. Margaret Hale's death occurred in a private space, with no witnesses, no obvious signs of violence, and especially no scientific tools sophisticated enough to read the traces hidden deep beneath the body's surface or on the evidence. When the autopsy concluded drowning with no alcohol or drugs found, when the bathroom scene featured a dislodged metal fixture that looked like the result of a slip and fall, the accident hypothesis became the easiest, least disruptive path for everyone involved. That very reasonableness became the armor protecting the perpetrator, because once a hypothesis is accepted early and repeated long enough, it ceases to be questioned and becomes the foundation around which all other details revolve. Leonard Hale's role over those years was thus shaped, not as a suspect, but as part of a framed story, and when a person is placed in the accident frame, all their behavior is interpreted as harmless. The most frightening aspect of this case was not the cruelty of the murder, but how a crime could hide in plain sight within the most familiar things, in the normality of family life, and in the belief that a bathroom is a place where accidents can happen without anyone being responsible. If forensic science had not advanced, if there had not been a systematic review of old files, if there had not been investigators willing to re-ask questions thought already answered, Margaret Hale's name might forever have been remembered as the victim of a regrettable mishap, and the perpetrator would have carried that secret to the end of his life, without ever facing justice. The decisive role of forensic science in reversing the old conclusion thus lay not only in providing new evidence, but in breaking the comfort of old assumptions. The second autopsy, with the discovery of bruises on the neck and nape, showed that the human body can retain truth longer than societal memory, that tiny traces can endure time if someone is patient and skilled enough to find them. The mechanical tests on the wall-mounted metal fixture did the same for the scene, turning a detail once seen as proof of accident into a silent witness, accusing a staged act. It was the combination of forensics and engineering, two fields separated in the original investigation, that created the irreversible turning point, because they were independent yet in agreement, each excluding accident in its own way, and together pointing to a single conclusion. This shows that justice does not depend only on finding motive or confession, but on the ability to test the physical reality of the stories told, the ability to ask what is possible and what is impossible, even if that answer shakes what has been believed for years. One small detail kept the truth buried for years, not a carefully hidden secret, but an assumption never tested, the assumption that a metal fixture in a bathroom could be dislodged by a slip and fall. That assumption, unchallenged, became the key piece for the entire accident story, and only when it was placed on the scale of science did the whole structure collapse. This carries a cold but important lesson in criminal investigation. The most seemingly obvious details are often the most dangerous, because they are easily accepted without proof. The Margaret Hale case shows that justice can be delayed not by human malice, but by overconfidence in simple explanations, and that a single unverified detail can be enough to conceal truth for decades. When the case closed with the final verdict, what remained was not just the sentence for Leonard Hale, but a profound adjustment in how the community and justice system understand death, accidents, and responsibility. It reminds us that every closed file should be considered philosophically temporary, that truth does not depend on legal deadlines, and that science, even arriving late, can still serve as justice's final knock on the door. Margaret Hale's story is thus not just about a murder solved belatedly, but a lasting warning about the power of unquestioned assumptions, the fragility of conclusions built on intuition, and the irreplaceable role of forensic science in forcing the past to answer questions it once evaded. When the final file was closed, it did not close the loss, but it closed a prolonged silence, restoring to Margaret Hale her rightful status, not as the victim of an accident, but as the victim of a crime, and affirming that even if it takes decades, truth can still be called by its proper name, if people keep asking questions and refuse easy answers. The Margaret Hale story reminds us that in today's America, where everyone believes the system will take care of it, the most dangerous thing can sometimes be an assumption too easily accepted. In 1962, people were comfortable with the accident label, because the bathroom scene looked normal, because the initial autopsy report said drowning, with no alcohol or drugs found, and because the detail of the dislodged metal towel bar rack sounded perfectly reasonable. That very reasonable detail nearly let Leonard Hale get away with it. His statement clung tightly to the metal fixture, making the story smooth and hard to challenge. Only when the file was pulled for review years later, when the body was exhumed and re-examined revealing bruises on the neck and nape consistent with drowning by force, and when mechanical tests proved the fixture could not be pulled loose by a fall inside the tub, but had to be yanked from outside, did the truth emerge. The real-world lesson for American life today is don't hesitate to demand independent verification when something doesn't add up, whether it's a death that looks like an accident, a workplace incident, or domestic violence hidden under a veneer of calm. If you're a family member, document the timeline, preserve photos, objects, request evidence storage, and ask directly, has this hypothesis been tested, or is it just guesswork? If you're in the community, don't let politeness, or the mindset of other people's business, stop you from reporting anything unusual. And most importantly, trust science and process, not because they're perfect, but because they can correct the past, the way a bruise on the neck and a towel rack finally spoke the truth after decades. If you believe buried truths like the Margaret Hale case deserve to be called by their rightful name, please subscribe to the channel, so we can continue following cold cases that science and persistence have brought to light. Thank you for watching to the very end, and see you in the next video, where a story thought long closed may reveal an even more haunting truth.